The rain fell in sheets across the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, each droplet catching the amber glow of the runway lights like scattered diamonds against black velvet. Captain Zara, Phantom, Volkov pulled her flight jacket tighter as she walked the perimeter, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected the ghostly silhouettes of dormant aircraft. The C-130 Hercules loomed before her like sleeping giants, their propellers still, and their cargo holds empty of secrets, for now. She'd been walking these same routes for 3 weeks, ever since the incident that no one talked about. The incident that had left her grounded, under investigation, and questioning everything she thought she knew about honor, duty, and the thin line between following orders and doing what's right. The brass had been clear. Stay quiet, stay invisible, let the storm pass. But storms had a way of growing stronger in silence. Captain? The voice emerged from the shadows between two hangars, gravelly and worn like old leather. Zara's hand instinctively moved toward her sidearm, then relaxed when she recognized the figure shuffling into the light. Dmitry Kozlov, everyone called him the Ghost, a former Spetsnaz operative turned maintenance worker, turned vagrant who somehow managed to live in the forgotten corners of the base without anyone officially noticing. His weathered face bore scars that told stories of Chechnya, Afghanistan, and conflicts that didn't have names in the history books. Tonight, those pale blue eyes held something different: fear. "Don't talk," he whispered urgently, glancing over his shoulder toward the command building where windows glowed like watchful eyes. "Not here. Not about what you saw." Zara felt her pulse quicken. 3 weeks ago, she'd witnessed something during a routine supply drop over the Panjshir Valley, something that made her stomach turn and her faith in the mission waver. She'd filed her report through proper channels, expecting swift action. Instead, she'd been met with bureaucratic stonewalling and veiled threats disguised as career advice. "They know you know," Dmitry continued, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "But what they don't know is that I know too, and what I know could save your life or end it." The old soldier pressed a small, wrapped object into her palm. "Hangar 7. Tomorrow, 300 hours. Come alone and trust no one in uniform." He melted back into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving Zara standing alone in the rain with more questions than answers and a growing certainty that her war was just beginning. Captain Zara Volkov had earned her call sign, Phantom, not through stealth or invisibility, but through her uncanny ability to appear exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. Growing up in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, the daughter of a Russian immigrant father and an American mother who'd met during the brief thaw of Glasnost, she'd learned early that survival meant existing in the spaces between worlds. Her father, Alexei, had been a pilot in the Soviet Air Force before defecting during a training mission in 1987. Her mother, Rebecca, had been the CIA operative assigned to debrief him. Their love story read like a Cold War novel, complete with secret meetings, coded messages, and the constant fear that the past would catch up with them. It had, eventually, but not in the way anyone expected. Zara had inherited her father's mechanical intuition and her mother's analytical mind, a combination that made her an exceptional pilot but a problematic subordinate. She asked too many questions, pushed too many boundaries, and had an irritating habit of being right when her superiors preferred her to be wrong. 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan had honed her skills but hadn't softened her edges. The package Dmitry had given her weighed less than her dog tags but felt heavier than her conscience. Inside the waterproof wrapping, she found a single photograph and a USB drive. The photograph showed 2 men in civilian clothes standing beside a black SUV in what looked like downtown Kabul. She recognized one face immediately: Colonel Marcus Ashford, her commanding officer, the man who'd been pressuring her to reconsider her account of the supply drop incident. The other man was a stranger, but his expensive suit and predatory smile suggested he wasn't military. The timestamp on the photo was from 2 days ago, well after the incident that had supposedly been classified as a training accident and buried under layers of official silence. Zara stared at the image until her eyes burned, trying to reconcile the man she'd trusted with her career and her life with the figure caught in what was clearly a clandestine meeting. The USB drive felt like it contained answers, but in her experience, answers often came with a price she wasn't sure she was prepared to pay. The rain had stopped, but the cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones. She thought about her father's stories of the old country, where speaking truth to power was a luxury few could afford and even fewer survived. She thought about her mother's quiet strength, the way she'd rebuilt her life after losing everything she thought she knew about the man she'd loved enough to betray her country for. Most of all, she thought about the faces of the villagers she'd seen during that supply drop, the way they'd looked up at her aircraft with hope that had curdled into horror when the bombs fell instead of the food and medical supplies she'd been told she was delivering. Hangar 7 loomed before her in the pre-dawn darkness like a cathedral of corrugated steel and broken promises. The digital clock on her watch read 2:55 hours, and each second felt like a heartbeat counting down to something irreversible. She'd spent the last 24 hours trying to convince herself that walking away was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that would preserve what remained of her career and her sanity. But some choices weren't really choices at all. They were tests of character disguised as options, and Zara had never been good at failing tests. The hangar's side door opened with a rusty squeal that seemed to echo across the entire base. Inside, emergency lighting cast long shadows between aircraft in various states of maintenance and disrepair. The smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid mingled with something else: coffee, cigarettes, and the distinctive odor of fear-induced sweat. Dmitri emerged from behind a covered helicopter, his movements cautious but determined. In the harsh lighting, his scars seemed deeper, his eyes more haunted. "You came. Good. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Zara admitted, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Part of me thinks this is the stupidest thing I've ever done, and I've done some spectacularly stupid things." The old soldier's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Stupid would be pretending this will go away on its own. What you witnessed wasn't an accident, Captain. It was a test, to see if you could be trusted to follow orders without question. You failed that test the moment you filed your report." He gestured for her to follow him deeper into the hangar, past rows of silent aircraft that seemed to watch their progress with dark, empty cockpits. Near the far end, he'd created a makeshift office using stacked crates and a salvaged desk lamp. Spread across the improvised workspace were photographs, documents, and what looked like surveillance equipment. "For 6 months, I've been documenting unauthorized flights, unexplained cargo manifests, and meetings between people who shouldn't know each other," Dmitri explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your Colonel Ashford is part of something bigger than you realize, something that goes all the way to the Pentagon and involves enough money to buy small countries." Zara felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she studied the evidence laid out before her. Flight logs for missions that didn't officially exist, photographs of weapons, shipments to groups that were supposedly enemies, bank records showing payments to offshore accounts linked to known arms dealers. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Because you're the only pilot with access to the aircraft they're using and the security clearance to get close to their operation," Dmitri replied. "And because you're probably the only person left on this base who still believes in doing the right thing, even when it costs everything." The weight of his words settled on her shoulders like lead blankets. Outside, she could hear the distant whine of jet engines as the day's first missions prepared for takeoff. Normal missions, flown by normal pilots who would return to normal debriefings and normal lives, unburdened by the knowledge that their war was built on foundations of sand and blood money. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Zara's voice came out steadier than she felt. Dimitri's smile was razor-thin and twice as sharp. "I'm asking you to become the phantom you were meant to be." The plan Dmitri outlined sounded like something from a spy novel, all coded communications, dead drops, and carefully orchestrated surveillance. But as Zara listened to the details, she realized it was grounded in the kind of operational security that only came from experience in places where mistakes weren't just career-ending, they were life-ending. The next unauthorized shipment goes out in 72 hours, he explained, pointing to a series of notations on a hijacked cargo manifest. Transport aircraft designation C-130J, tail number 88602, scheduled for routine maintenance inspection. Your signature is required for the pre-flight authorization. Zara studied the document, noting discrepancies that would be invisible to casual observation, but glaring to anyone who understood the intricate bureaucracy of military logistics. The cargo weight was listed as medical supplies, but the gross takeoff weight suggested something much denser. The destination was marked as a forward operating base in Helmand Province, but she knew that particular outpost had been abandoned 6 months earlier. They're using my authorization to legitimize whatever they're moving, she realized, feeling sick to her stomach. How many times has this happened? 17 confirmed flights over the past 4 months, Dmitri replied grimly. Each one carrying approximately 2 tons of what I believe to be small arms, ammunition, and possibly explosives to locations that officially don't exist on current operational maps. The implications hit her like a physical blow. 17 flights meant 17 times she'd unknowingly signed off on operations that violated international law, military protocol, and everything she'd sworn to uphold when she'd accepted her commission. 17 times her signature had been used to legitimize what amounted to treason. The beauty of their system is its simplicity, Dmitri continued. They use legitimate aircraft, legitimate flight crews, and legitimate paperwork. The only thing that's not legitimate is the cargo and the destination. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the evidence is scattered across 3 countries and buried under layers of operational security classifications. Zara's hands shook as she lit a cigarette, a habit she'd picked up during her first combat tour and never quite managed to quit. The smoke helped mask the smell of fear that seemed to permeate everything in the hangar. "What happens when they realize I know?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dmitri's expression darkened. "You become a liability that needs to be managed. In my experience, military organizations have very efficient methods for managing liabilities, especially liabilities that can testify before congressional committees." The cigarette tasted like ashes and regret. Outside, dawn was beginning to paint the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson, colors that reminded her of the sunrise she'd watched from the cockpit during her last honest mission, a medical evacuation flight that had saved 12 lives and restored her faith in the purpose of her service. That faith felt very far away now, buried under layers of deception and complicity that seemed to grow thicker with each revelation. But beneath the cynicism and fear, something else was stirring, a cold anger that burned steady as a pilot light, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The next 48 hours passed in a haze of routine duties and mounting tension. Zara went through the motions of her daily responsibilities, flight planning, equipment inspections, briefings that felt increasingly hollow, while wrestling with the weight of knowledge that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. She found herself studying her fellow officers with new eyes, searching for tells that might indicate who could be trusted and who might be part of the conspiracy. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also educational. She began to notice patterns of behavior she'd previously dismissed as harmless, hushed conversations that stopped when she approached, brief glances exchanged during briefings, the way certain names were never mentioned in official reports. Colonel Ashford maintained his usual professional demeanor, but she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. During their standard weekly meeting, His questions probed just a little too deeply into her recent activities, her interactions with base personnel, her thoughts on mission effectiveness and operational security. "You seem distracted lately, Captain," he observed, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Is everything all right at home? Any personal issues I should know about?" The concern in his voice sounded genuine, which made it all the more unsettling. She'd served under his command for 18 months, respected his tactical acumen, even admired his ability to maintain morale during the grittiest parts of their deployment. Learning that he might be betraying everything they'd sworn to protect felt like discovering that gravity was optional. "Nothing that would affect my performance, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady and her expression neutral. "Just working through some things." His smile was paternal, understanding, and utterly terrifying in its implications. "We all have things to work through, Captain. The important thing is knowing when to ask for help and when to let sleeping dogs lie. Some problems solve themselves if you give them time and space." The warning couldn't have been clearer if he'd written it in block letters across her forehead. She nodded respectfully, made appropriate responses to his remaining questions, and left his office with the distinct impression that she was running out of time. That evening, she found a note in her quarters, a single line of text written in Dimitri's careful Cyrillic script. "The dog that doesn't bark sees everything." 24 hours later, she stood in the pre-flight preparation area watching mechanics load cargo containers into the belly of C-130J tail number 88602. The manifest listed medical supplies destined for Fob Chapman, but Chapman had been closed for renovation since March. The discrepancy was so obvious that it almost felt like a test of her willingness to ignore what was literally staring her in the face. Captain Torres, the aircraft commander for this flight, was a competent pilot with 7 years of transport experience and a reputation for following regulations to the letter. She'd flown with him twice before on legitimate missions and found him professional, thorough, and refreshingly free of the casual machismo that infected too many military aviators. "Interesting cargo load today," she commented casually as she reviewed his pre-flight checklist. Torres glanced around nervously before responding, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the busy flight line. "Yeah, well, you know how it is. They don't pay us to ask questions, just to deliver packages safely and on time." The resignation in his voice told her everything she needed to know. He was aware that something wasn't right, but he'd made the calculation that keeping his head down was safer than rocking the boat. She couldn't blame him. She'd made the same calculation herself for weeks before Dimitri had forced her to confront the reality of what that silence was enabling. As she signed the authorization forms, her hand trembled slightly. Her signature felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in, but it was also the key to unraveling a conspiracy that had turned her war into a profit center for people who would never hear the screams of the innocent or smell the smoke of villages that burned because weapons had been delivered to the wrong hands. The aircraft taxied toward the runway with its cargo of secrets and lies, carrying her complicity into the morning sky. But this time, she was counting on that complicity to finally expose the truth. The secure satellite phone Dimitri had given her felt like a brick in her pocket as she made her way to the communications bunker. The number he'd programmed into the device was supposedly connected to someone at the Defense Intelligence Agency, a contact from his previous life who specialized in investigating corruption within military procurement systems. Agent Sarah Chen answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour in Washington, D.C. "I've been expecting your call, Captain Volkov. Dmitry Kozlov speaks very highly of your integrity and your commitment to doing the right thing." The irony of having a conversation about integrity while facilitating arms smuggling wasn't lost on Zara, but she pressed forward. "Agent Chen, I need to know that what I'm about to tell you won't just disappear into another bureaucratic black hole. People are going to die if this continues, and I'm not sure I can live with being part of it anymore. I understand your concerns, and I can assure you that DIA takes allegations of this nature very seriously. We have reason to believe that what you've discovered is part of a much larger pattern of unauthorized weapons transfers that extends beyond your base and possibly beyond Afghanistan. The confirmation that her situation was part of something bigger should have been reassuring, but instead it filled her with a cold dread. If the conspiracy reached as high as Chen was implying, then the people involved had resources and influence that made her feel like an ant trying to stop a steamroller. "What do you need from me?" she asked, watching the horizon where C-130J-88602 had disappeared carrying its illicit cargo toward coordinates that existed only on falsified flight plans. "We need documentation, evidence that can stand up in court and congressional hearings. Flight logs, cargo manifests, communications records, anything that establishes a pattern of deliberate falsification rather than administrative error." Zara thought about Dimitri's collection of evidence, carefully gathered over months of patient surveillance and systematic documentation. "That can be arranged, but I need guarantees about protection for my source and for myself. The people involved in this have already demonstrated that they're willing to cover their tracks by any means necessary." Agent Chen's pause was long enough to be worrying. "Captain, I won't lie to you about the risks involved. The kind of people who organize operations like this have significant resources and very few scruples about using them. But I can tell you that DIA has successfully prosecuted similar cases, and we have protocols in place to protect witnesses and assets." Protocols sounded reassuring in theory, but Zara had seen enough of military bureaucracy to know that protocols were only as strong as the people implementing them. Still, the alternative was to continue enabling operations that violated everything she'd sworn to protect. "All right, Agent Chen, I'm in. What happens next?" The next phase of the operation required her to become something she'd never been before, a spy in her own unit. The transition felt unnatural, like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly. Every conversation became a potential intelligence-gathering opportunity, every interaction a chance to document suspicious behavior or gather evidence of wrongdoing. Dimitri had taught her the basics of covert photography, using a modified smartphone that looked standard issue, but contained sophisticated surveillance capabilities. She practiced taking pictures without looking at the screen, memorized the locations of hidden cameras and recording devices, and learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when she was being watched. The psychological toll was immediate and exhausting. Paranoia became her constant companion, making every casual greeting feel like a potential interrogation, and every routine duty seem like a trap. She'd always prided herself on her ability to maintain situational awareness in combat, but this was different. This was combat where the enemies wore the same uniform she did and smiled when they talked about duty and honor. 3 days into her new role as an intelligence asset, she received her first real test. Colonel Ashford called her into his office for what he described as a routine discussion about upcoming mission assignments, but the presence of 2 men in civilian suits suggested something more significant was happening. "Captain Volkov, I'd like you to meet representatives from Defense Logistics Agency," Ashford said, his tone carefully neutral. "They're conducting an efficiency review of our cargo operations and would like to discuss some irregularities they've noticed in our paperwork." The word irregularities hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Zara forced herself to remain calm, drawing on the same mental discipline that had gotten her through emergency procedures training and combat situations. The key was to appear cooperative while revealing nothing that could compromise the investigation or put Dimitri at risk. The shorter of the 2 men, who introduced himself only as Mr. Davidson, had the kind of generic appearance that suggested he spent a lot of time trying not to be memorable. His partner, Mr. Stevens, was larger and more obviously physical, the kind of person who communicated primarily through intimidation. Captain, we've noticed some inconsistencies in cargo manifests for flights you've authorized over the past few months, Davidson said, consulting a tablet that contained what appeared to be copies of official documents. Nothing dramatic, just small discrepancies in weight calculations and destination codes that suggest possible data entry errors. The phrase data entry errors was clearly meant to provide her with an easy explanation that would satisfy everyone and make the problem disappear. All she had to do was nod, apologize for any confusion, and promise to be more careful in the future. It would be simple, safe, and completely inadequate to address the larger issues at stake. I'd be happy to review any specific examples you've identified, she replied carefully. Accurate record-keeping is essential for operational safety and mission success. Stevens shifted in his chair, a subtle movement that nonetheless conveyed volumes about his opinion of her response. Davidson's smile became marginally less warm. Of course, Captain, we appreciate your commitment to accuracy. Perhaps you could walk us through your standard procedures for reviewing cargo documentation before signing authorizations. For the next 30 minutes, they asked increasingly detailed questions about her processes, her interactions with cargo personnel, and her knowledge of transport protocols. Each question felt like a probe designed to identify weaknesses in her story or gaps in her knowledge that could be exploited. By the time they finished, Zara felt like she'd been through a psychological stress test. But she'd also learned something valuable. They suspected she knew more than she was admitting, but they weren't certain how much she knew or whether she represented a genuine threat to their operation. That evening, she transmitted her first intelligence report to Agent Chen, documenting the meeting and providing detailed descriptions of the two investigators. The response came back within hours. Both men were known intelligence operatives with connections to private military contractors and a history of handling sensitive logistics operations in conflict zones. The investigation was accelerating, and she was rapidly approaching the point where neutrality would no longer be an option. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos, a cargo specialist she'd worked with on dozens of legitimate missions, approached her during a routine maintenance inspection with information that changed everything. "Captain, I need to talk to someone I can trust," he said, his usually steady demeanor cracked by obvious stress. "Something's been bothering me for months, and after seeing those DLA guys asking questions, I figured it was time to speak up." Santos had 23 years of military service, a spotless record, and a reputation for absolute reliability in handling sensitive cargo. If he was concerned about something, it was worth taking seriously. They found privacy in a storage room filled with spare parts and maintenance equipment, surrounded by the familiar smell of hydraulic fluid and metal shavings that reminded Zara of her father's garage workshop. "I've been tracking weight discrepancies on outbound cargo flights," Santos explained, producing a small notebook filled with handwritten calculations. "Nothing obvious, just small differences between what the manifest says we're loading and what the aircraft weight and balance actually shows." The notebook contained 4 months of meticulous record-keeping, documenting systematic variations that individually meant nothing, but collectively painted a picture of deliberate deception. Someone had been replacing legitimate cargo with heavier materials, then falsifying the documentation to cover their tracks. "The thing is, Captain, these weight differences only show up on flights that get special handling instructions from Colonel Ashford's office. Regular cargo runs match their manifests perfectly, but these particular flights are consistently overweight by margins that suggest we're loading military hardware instead of the medical supplies and food aid listed on the paperwork." Santos's evidence was exactly what Agent Chen had requested, documentation that established a clear pattern of falsification that couldn't be dismissed as administrative error. But more importantly, it provided a window into the operational methodology that could be used to predict and potentially intercept future smuggling operations. "Sergeant, what made you start tracking this information?" she asked, studying the precise calculations that represented hundreds of hours of careful observation. His expression darkened. "My son is serving with the 82nd in Helmand Province. 3 weeks ago, his unit was ambushed by insurgents carrying weapons that matched the serial numbers on equipment that had been reported destroyed in a depot fire 2 months earlier. American weapons, Captain. Weapons that were supposed to be ash were being used to kill American soldiers." The personal dimension of the conspiracy hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about corruption or illegal arms sales. It was about American service members being killed with weapons that had been diverted from their own supply chains. "What do you need from me, Sergeant?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I need someone with the authority and security clearance to make sure this information reaches people who can do something about it," Santos replied. "I need to know that my son's friends didn't die so some colonel could buy a vacation home." That night, she transmitted Santos's evidence to Agent Chen, along with a detailed operational assessment of the smuggling network's methodology. The response was immediate and unambiguous. DIA was prepared to move forward with arrests and seizures within 48 hours, but they needed her to identify the next scheduled shipment to provide actionable intelligence that could lead to interdiction. The final phase was beginning, and there would be no turning back. The next unauthorized shipment was scheduled for 600 hours on a Tuesday that dawned clear and cold, with visibility unlimited and winds that would make for textbook takeoff conditions. C-130 H-Tail number 923283 sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its cargo hold filled with containers that officially contained winter clothing and medical supplies for a forward operating base in Kandahar Province. Zara watched the loading process from the Flight Operations Center, using surveillance equipment Dmitry had positioned throughout the cargo area to document every aspect of the operation. The containers being loaded were clearly heavier than the manifest indicated. It took 4 men to move items that should have required only 2, and several bore markings that had been hastily painted over or obscured. Captain Rebecca Martinez, the aircraft commander for this flight, was someone Zara had never worked with before. Her service record showed extensive transport experience, but there were gaps in her deployment history that suggested time spent on classified operations. More troubling was her financial situation. Public records indicated recent purchases that exceeded her military salary by a significant margin. At 5:30 hours, Zara signed the authorization forms with a sense of finality that felt like stepping off a cliff. Her signature would legitimize the operation in the eyes of anyone conducting casual oversight, but it would also trigger a chain of events that would expose everyone involved in the conspiracy. Agent Chen's team was positioned at 3 different points along the aircraft's planned route, ready to intercept the flight and secure the cargo before it could be delivered to its intended recipients. Additional teams were preparing simultaneous raids on financial accounts, communication networks, and personnel involved in the logistics chain. As C-130 H-923283 taxied toward the runway, Zara felt the weight of 18 months of complicity lifting from her shoulders. Every signature she'd provided, every question she hadn't asked, every moment she'd chosen silence over action, all of it was about to be redeemed by this single act of courage disguised as routine paperwork. The aircraft lifted off at exactly 6:07 hours, climbing into morning sky that seemed unusually bright and clear. Zara watched it disappear toward the horizon, carrying its cargo of evidence and secrets toward an interception that would change everything. 37 minutes later, her secure phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Chen. Package delivered. Spring cleaning begins now. Across the base, coordinated arrests were already in progress. The arrests happened with the swift, methodical precision of a military operation. Colonel Ashford was taken into custody during a staff meeting, his expression shifting from confusion to resignation as federal agents read him his rights. Captain Martinez's aircraft was intercepted by F-16s and forced to land at Kandahar Airfield, where the cargo was immediately secured and documented. Zara watched the events unfold from the Flight Operations Center, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension that made it difficult to concentrate on routine duties. The base felt different somehow, as if the removal of the conspiracy had changed the atmospheric pressure or shifted the magnetic field. Agent Chen arrived on base 8 hours after the operation concluded, accompanied by a team of investigators who began the painstaking process of documenting evidence and conducting interviews. She was younger than Zara had expected, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested someone who took professional obligations very seriously. Captain Volkov, your courage in coming forward has helped us expose a network that was responsible for diverting millions of dollars worth of weapons and equipment to unauthorized recipients, Chen explained during their debriefing. The evidence you and your sources provided will be crucial in prosecuting not just the individuals at this base, but the larger organization they were working for. The larger organization turned out to be more extensive than anyone had imagined. The arms trafficking operation involved personnel at 7 different military installations, 3 private military contractors, and a network of offshore financial institutions that specialized in laundering money from illegal weapons sales. What happens now? Zara asked, watching through the window as investigators loaded boxes of evidence into transport vehicles. Now we build cases that will hold up in court, Chen replied. And now you become a key witness in what will likely be one of the largest military corruption trials in recent history. That means protection details, safe houses, and probably several years of legal proceedings. The prospect of extended legal battles was daunting, but it was also oddly liberating. For the first time in months, she wouldn't have to lie about her knowledge or pretend to be ignorant of crimes being committed in her name. Dmitri appeared in the doorway, escorted by 2 federal agents who seemed unsure whether to treat him as a witness or a suspect. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes held a satisfaction that suggested justice delayed was still justice worth pursuing. Captain Phantom, he said, using her call sign with something approaching pride. You did good work. Your father would be proud. The reference to her father caught her off guard, until she realized that Dimitri's intelligence background probably included knowledge of her family history that wasn't part of any official record. How did you know about my father? She asked. His smile was enigmatic. In my former profession, we made it our business to know about the children of defectors. Your father was a good pilot and an honorable man who chose conscience over country. The apple, as they say, does not fall far from the tree. The compliment felt like vindication for choices that had seemed increasingly questionable as the investigation progressed. She'd betrayed the trust of colleagues and superiors, violated operational security protocols, and risked her career on the testimony of a man living in the shadows of an Afghan airbase. But she'd also prevented American weapons from being used to kill American soldiers, exposed a conspiracy that violated international law, and upheld the oath she'd sworn when she'd accepted her commission. Agent Chen was right. Her father would have been proud. The trial lasted 14 months and became a media sensation that exposed the darker aspects of military contracting and overseas operations. Zara testified for 6 days, detailing her discovery of the conspiracy and her decision to cooperate with federal investigators despite the personal and professional risks involved. Colonel Ashford received 18 years in federal prison for conspiracy, arms trafficking, and violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Captain Martinez was sentenced to 12 years. 17 other military personnel and civilian contractors received sentences ranging from probation to 15 years in prison. The financial impact was staggering. Investigators ultimately recovered over $43 million in illegally obtained assets and traced weapons shipments to insurgent groups in 7 different countries. The weapons that had been used against Sergeant Santos's unit were conclusively linked to the trafficking network, providing closure for families who had lost loved ones to what they'd believed were enemy weapons. Zara's role in exposing the conspiracy earned her both commendation and criticism from different quarters. Some viewed her as a whistleblower who had courageously exposed corruption. Others saw her as a traitor who had violated the chain of command and damaged unit cohesion. The military justice system took a pragmatic approach. Her actions had violated several regulations regarding communication with outside agencies and operational security, but they had also prevented ongoing crimes and protected national security interests. The result was a formal reprimand that would remain in her personnel file, balanced by a commendation for exceptional service under difficult circumstances. More importantly, she was offered the opportunity to transfer to a new assignment where her experience with corruption investigations could be put to constructive use. The Defense Intelligence Agency was expanding its Internal Affairs Division and needed officers with operational experience and demonstrated integrity. Agent Chen made the recruitment pitch during their final meeting at the courthouse, where the last of the trafficking conspirators had just been sentenced. "We need people who understand how military systems actually work, not just how they're supposed to work on paper," Chen explained. "People who can recognize when something doesn't look right and have the courage to ask difficult questions." The offer was tempting, but it would mean leaving flight operations for a career in investigation and analysis. It would mean trading the cockpit for a desk, the sky for conference rooms filled with documents and evidence photos. "Can I think about it?" Zara asked. "Of course, take all the time you need. The offer will remain open as long as you're interested." That evening, she called her father from her hotel room in Arlington. At 73, Alexei Volkov was still sharp and opinionated, still proud of his daughter's service, and still haunted by his own choices during the Cold War. "Papa, I have a decision to make about my career," she began, then explained the situation in careful terms that avoided classified information, but conveyed the essential elements of her dilemma. His response was characteristically direct. "Zarachka, you have always been guided by your conscience, even when it made your life more difficult. This is not a time to start ignoring that voice. The question is not what will make you happy or successful. The question is what will let you sleep peacefully knowing you have done your duty to something larger than yourself." The wisdom in his words was simple and undeniable. She had spent her entire career trying to serve something larger than herself, and that service had led her to this moment where she could continue that mission.